starting off with the sport of karate. Now, most MMA fans are very well aware of karate because of guys like Michael Venom Page, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, but I would say there's two main sects of karate. There's point fighting karate, which, those two fall under, but there's also Kyokushin karate, a bit of a lesser known style that, Giga Chikadze came from, Georges St. Pierre came from, Uriah Hall came from this discipline. I will say it's a shame because if you were to walk up to the average person on the street and you told them that you did karate, they would probably feel bad for you. I think that they would wish that you had kept that to yourself because, to the average person, karate is something you do when you're 8 years old. It's not a serious fighting art. But Kyokushin karate is pretty goddamn gnarly. It's bare knuckle, first and foremost. It's full contact. You are allowed to kick to the head, to the midsection, to the legs, but you're only allowed to punch to the body. And let me just tell you something. The sheer amount of bare knuckle body shots these guys eat, it is tremendous. Like, again, this deserves respect. This is gnarly as all holy hell. Though, as I'm sure you can imagine, a discipline like this based on the rule set, it's going to have its advantages, but it's also going to have its disadvantages. And I think obviously the main one is, for one, I actually do think the kicking dexterity you're going to develop from a martial art like this is going to be phenomenal. Look, I'm sure, some of you guys may know this, but I don't talk about it a lot. But when I was a child, you could consider me as a Taekwondo prodigy. When I was a small child, I think that most parents at my dojo viewed me as one of the more elite students, to say the least. And point is, I know a lot about kicking, all right? And let me tell you something right now. Because you're not allowed to punch to the head, the range is very, very close, right? Guys are right in each other's faces ripping body shots. Obviously, because, if you try to land a body shot at range, you are just risking getting nailed in the head with a fucking high kick. You know what I mean? You have to be in close. But, again, the dexterity these guys develop for that reason is absolutely phenomenal. Of course, though, I'm sure as you can tell, right, when it comes to transferring this to MMA, if you are not dealing with getting punched in the face regularly, for one, you're used to fighting at a distance that isn't super realistic, but also you just don't develop any sort of head movement. And this is a problem that, Giga Chikadze absolutely had. It's a problem that Uriah Hall had, right? Look at when Giga Chikadze fought Arnold Allen. Giga's speed and his kicks are absolutely insane. I mean, Giga, when he fought Edson Barbosa, went kick for kick with him and completely outclassed him. But when Allen closed the distance, just look at how tall and how just straight he's standing. Not a lot of head movement. He's not super elusive. And, Arnold Allen won this fight purely because he was able to get on the inside and just land a few effective headshots a couple times per round. Uriah Hall, right? He was known for phenomenal athleticism, insane kicks, but when he fought Kelvin Gastelum in the tough finale, Kelvin won because he closed the distance, just took the fight to him, got into boxing range, and just landed upstairs. And you saw how stationary he was getting. There was not a lot of good head movement, and that is why he lost the fight. Oh, right. Someone like Georges St. Pierre, who from age, 8 all the way till he was a late teen, did Kyokushin karate, but he was, I would say, like the perfect martial artist in the sense of there were a lot of aspects of karate that he would use in MMA, but he definitely abandoned the weaker aspects of it, and his striking style, it was much more of a conglomerate of a lot of different striking arts. Obviously, a lot of pure boxing, working with Freddie Roach, so, obviously, there are a lot of great aspects of Kyokushin karate. I mean, man, you are going to toughen your body up to punishment for sure, but if that's going to be sort of your main striking discipline, we've seen the issues that are going to come from that. But going to point fighting karate, it's very, very different, right? Point fighting karate, the stance is extremely sideways, obviously, because you are making yourself a much more narrow target to land on, because in point fighting, right, it's not full contact, you're not supposed to hit hard, but landing on your opponent scores you a point. So these guys are masters at not getting hit. And obviously, right, you look at Michael Venom Page, who has an insane amount of speed and athleticism. The range he fights at is essentially completely unfair. Like, you can't just kickbox with this guy. He's fighting at a range that is so foreign to you. Obviously, standing sideways allows you to move forward and backwards at a speed that you just cannot keep up with fighting in any sort of like a traditional kickboxing, Muay Thai-esque stance where you're more squared. So again, the range and the speed at which he can dart in and out is something that you just cannot deal with. And also, standing sideways actually really helps when it comes to wrestling because it denies the double leg. The only thing you can go for is a single. You cannot hit a double leg when you're standing completely sideways. And obviously, single legs for the most part are way easier to defend than double legs. But I think the biggest issue fundamentally with the skills you're going to build from this style when it comes to transferring it to MMA is, unfortunately, the arena in which you're fighting in is surrounded by a fence. And that is really not good for this style. I mean, you look at essentially almost every single time somebody defeated Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, it came from the fact of the fence. I mean, almost every time. Because when you pressure this style up against the fence, it does two things. One, it eliminates their distance management, which is the absolute best aspect of their game. But it also forces them to square their stance out, and now every single advantage that comes from that karate stance is also completely gone, right? Steve Wonderboy Thompson, when he fought Bilal pressures him to the fence, his stance squares out, boom, the double leg is wide open, he takes advantage of it. When he fought Darren Till way back in the day, right? That fight was close, but Wonderboy was doing very, very well. Up until round 5, Darren Till pressures him to the fence, his stance squares out, there's no more distance management, boom, he catches him and drops him, and that was enough to get him the decision. Joaquin Buckley, right, he gets knocked out once he gets pressured up against the fence and his stance squares out. You know, even Michael Venom Page, right? MVP, I think he is, obviously taller, longer, faster than Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and I think he's a way trickier puzzle to deal with. But, when he fought Ian Gary, right, he was winning that fight, right? Round 1, obviously, Ian catches a kick to take him down. But round 2, he won that round easily. He was winning round 3 up until Ian Gary finally started really pressuring him. The distance management is gone. He tries to go for a right hand, which again squares out the stance. Boom, he beats him to the double leg and is able to take his back. And that is what won him that fight. If Joe Rogan got his way, and, somehow MMA took place in the hyperbolic time chamber, frankly, I don't know if you can reliably beat MVP. Obviously, there's always a chance you time a leg kick off one of his blitzes like Douglas Lima and land an uppercut, right? But it's just so hard to do with the speed, right? But, in terms of like a fundamental game plan to enact to beat him in a, white void with no out of bounds, I don't know if there's a solid way to beat him, frankly. But, again, because MMA takes place within a cage, that is going to always really affect the karate style. And pressure just completely eliminates all advantages that's going to come from it. But now, moving on to Sambo, the art of Sambo, if you want to call it that. The thing about Sambo, I'm sure as you can tell by probably the thumbnail of this video, unless I've changed it since then, it's fake. Sambo is fake. Sambo is not real. Sambo is essentially a figment of your imagination. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? What do I mean by that? Sambo is not a martial art. Sambo is a rule set, and I think there's a very big difference. I think that, take every single grappling art that exists, every single one, there's something unique about it in terms of techniques, right? But Sambo, there's nothing unique about it. Sambo is not its own martial art. Sambo is a collection of martial arts. Sambo, you cannot name me one technique that is in Sambo that is not in another martial art, right? Sambo is just a carbon copy of a bunch of things that already exist, all kind of piled on top of each other. And again, right, it's not a martial art, all right? That's its problem. Now, obviously, look, this isn't a bad thing, to be fair. I mean, Sambo, I actually think is very overpowered because it's just such a well-rounded grappling art. There's judo, there's wrestling, there's submissions. It's not perfect, right? There's only certain submissions that are allowed in Sambo. I mean, There's no strangles at all. There's no kimuras. There's no shoulder locks, no neck cranks, anything like that, right? There's just, traditional leg locks, straight ankle locks, knee bars, toe holds. You can do arm bars, but, that's it. And also you're only allowed to grapple on the ground for 60 seconds, but that is if anything is actually going on. If neither guy is making any progress or they're just stalemating on the ground, they get stood back up. So there is, some limitations in terms of like developing really good get-ups or, really good back and forth, ground grappling. But still, in terms of being an extremely well-rounded art, it is that. You know what I mean? If a pure wrestler goes against a Sambo guy, well, they also have wrestling skills mixed in with judo throws and mixed in with certain submissions. So, look, it's very good, obviously, right? It's insanely good. But for Khabib within an MMA context to proudly stand up at the ceremonial weigh-in saying that if Sambo was easy, it'd be called jiu-jitsu, I'm like, well, okay, but that's just so unfair. That's like within an MMA context, me going, if MMA was easy, it'd be called boxing. It's like, well, yeah, but like you just took parts of boxing and then added in a bunch of other martial arts, so it's not fair, all right? Of course you're going to be better than it within a context like MMA, obviously, right? You can't make that comparison, all right? Because again, Sambo has just stolen every single technique it uses from a bunch of other martial arts, put it all together into this really well-rounded art and just said, okay, well, we're the best. It's like, okay, yeah, of course you're the best. You just took everything from everybody else, all right? Now, whenever I say this, the one rebuttal I get is, well, actually, jiu-jitsu is the exact same thing because it was all just taken from judo. But what I would say as a rebuttal to you is that, no, it's actually not the exact same thing, and it's actually not all taken from judo because, listen, I will shut the fuck up if you can find me one clip, one example of somebody hitting a berimbolo prior to it being used in jiu-jitsu. You can't do it because this was a move that was invented in jiu-jitsu. It only makes sense to use within a jiu-jitsu context. And again, you cannot say the same thing for any technique that is used within Sambo. But again, I'm just a little jealous, so you got to let me have this one thing to complain about. But now, the sport of kickboxing, when it comes to MMA, I think that, obviously there are going to be some similarities to Muay Thai, but I think there are also some very key differences. I think for one, right, kickboxers generally have a lot better movement. They cut angles better than guys you see come from more traditional Muay Thai. I think when it comes to kickboxing, the biggest problem you're going to find is they are definitely hindered the absolute most out of any other striking art when it comes to switching from the traditional gloves to the 4-ounce gloves. That is just a massive problem for most kickboxers, and the reason for that is, within a kickboxing context, you can't use a tremendous amount of head movement. It's just not a good idea. When you're bobbing and shifting and moving and really ducking low and really using, this Canelo-style head movement, you're going to get kicked in the head. I mean, you're just gonna. Therefore, it's very common that guys use high guard. They keep up a really tight high guard. They walk you down, absorb punches on the gloves. Because of the nature of kickboxing, right? You have to stand so much more square. And standing square, it limits your ability to roll with shots, to shoulder roll, your ability to land in the pocket. I mean, and you see that in MMA when someone like Israel Adesanya enters the pocket, right? I mean, his muscle memory is to stand very square. And you just see how frankly not good it looks from like pure boxing perspective. But again, this doesn't really matter in a kickboxing context, but in MMA with the 4-ounce gloves, it becomes so much more life or death to be sharp from these positions, right? And Israel Adesanya, for example, has never been sharp from these positions. I mean, just look at the defense right here. Let's look at this defense right here, all right? Luckily, Adesanya was graced that, when he finally got exposed for this defense against the best boxer he's ever fought, everybody just called him washed instead of just saying, oh, well, actually, this has always been a problem. But, again, right, it's there. Alex Pereira, it's a very similar thing, right? Again, because of the sheer amount of power he has, he can get away with this. But when guys really close the distance with him, that square stance that you're going to develop in kickboxing, it just doesn't work out super well. I mean, you see how awkward he looks right here. And again, when he does land in the pocket, because of the power, it's okay. But you just see what it looks like here. It's not super sharp. But it's funny because, MMA striking sort of mimics kickboxing in the sense of things you're allowed to do, right? Kicks, punches, knees to the body. It's all there, right? You would assume that it kind of mimics itself very, very well. But look at Tom Aspinall versus Alexander Volkov, right? Can you imagine how different that fight would have been in a pure kickboxing context, where Volkov could have had the bigger gloves, he could have a tight high guard, he could be walking Tom down, he could have mimicked almost exactly what Jason Wilness did to beat Israel Adesanya, but again, when it comes to kickboxing in particular, it is the one striking art that I think more than pretty much any other one that you lose the traditional gloves, and it's just such a hindrance to the style, because the defensive tendencies that you're going to build within a traditional kickboxing context doesn't translate super well. I mean, there is not a universe where in a kickboxing match, Cyril Gane is going to get tagged like this by Tai Tuivasa. Only in MMA can he sneak this shot through the guard. I mean, even guys who are really good boxers, have the propensity to get caught with a clean shot because of the smaller gloves, right? But now imagine, being a pure kickboxer in this sense. It could be absolutely detrimental to you, right? Again, if you're fighting Paulo Costa, Jared Cannonier, and Marvin Vettori, these guys have no shot of exposing you for this weakness, right? If Israel Adesanya right now fought through all three of those guys back to back, all of a sudden it'd be so funny to see everybody be like, whoa, he was washed when he fought a Mavov, but he's not washed anymore. How could this be? It's like, no, he would just always get knocked out by a Mavov because he's going to use this defense that he's always used against him, and a Mavov's game is blitzing at you with boxing. But regardless, right? Obviously, right, it's very similar to Muay Thai. The same issues that Muay Thai have that we've discussed in the past. But Muay Thai is even more stationary, more built for defending low kicks, right? Because you're so light on that lead leg and you're not moving a lot. Kickboxing, you're lighter. You do throw a little bit more combinations. You have better angles and better footwork and better movement. So I do think overall it does transfer better to MMA, but it does have its own problems. And now last but not least, the problem with MMA in MMA. I've seen a lot of people make jokes about this, but the truth is I think you actually there are things to discuss with this topic. Because, look, there was a time, right, where if you were competing in MMA, it's because you started off with a martial art and then you transferred over to MMA, right? And I still think that's a lot of people. But, inevitably, it's going to get to a point where pretty much every single person fighting in the UFC from day one of their martial arts journey, their goal was to go to the UFC. They don't come from a base martial art per se, right? Guys sort of like Raul Rosas Jr., I even think Rory McDonald was probably the first guy that of note that you can say, came from, this sort of background, right? But still, all of these guys still train every single martial art individually. You have to, because the problem is, right, there's this delicate balance you have to find in this sense of, right, to become elite in MMA, every single individual skill set you have has to blend seamlessly together. The more it blends seamlessly, the better you're going to be. I think someone like George St. Pierre fits this criteria very well. I think even Khabib fit this criteria very, very well. His striking style was built perfectly to complement his grappling. He used a lot of footwork, was very, very careful on the feet. He moved a lot. He was always standing just outside of range, and he would find moments to blitz at you with really fast, wild combinations that would get guys to back up, cover up to the fence, where boom, he would immediately chain it into his takedown, and then he would start working all of his grappling sequences, right? It is so important to make sure that, all your skills are built into an MMA context. But the problem is, there's no way that you can from day one only train MMA, right? There's just no way you can do that, because you're never going to become elite at any individual skill if you do. I think, theoretically, you can make it work, right? You can make it work. The problem is, though, right, let's say all I've done is MMA classes. I've learned striking within an MMA class. I've learned grappling within an MMA class. You can become really, really good, but the problem is when you come up against a real specialist, you're going to kind of be screwed, you know? I mean, listen, man, if fucking Charles Oliveira can use an omoplata to sweep and dominate on the ground someone to the caliber of Gamrot, if you have not spent any time doing traditional jiu-jitsu and he puts you into a position like this, what the fuck are you gonna do? You're screwed. You are completely and utterly screwed. When Ilia Topuria starts walking you down, bobbing his head back and forth, getting you up to the fence, if you just never train traditional boxing, you're gonna be so far behind because he's just so much more elite than you in that one aspect, right? And you can say this with every single individual thing, right? When fucking, an Olympic gold medalist caliber wrestler who transferred to MMA fucking feints the shot and gets you to sprawl and circles to your back, then hits the takedown, it's like, man, you gotta be, you have to train these skills individually if you want any chance of contending with real specialists. So I think theoretically it can work, right? And I again, like I said, I do think we'll get to a point where every single person in the UFC from day one knew they were going to be MMA fighters. But you still have to get a base in every individual grappling art if you're going to contend with any specialist. And I think that's kind of the important distinction there. And that's why I think that, each individual martial art will always still have its place in MMA.